Next panel is on layers and scaling. It will be moderated by my co-president, Chunda, and I'll allow him to introduce the rest of the speakers. Welcome.
Thank you for the intro. Yeah, all the mics are up there. My bad. I don't think it matters. All right. Yeah, let's start by first giving a hand to all the speakers who decided to come out today and spend some time here with us. Yep, so I'm going to go and first give some quick intros. Like Sophia said, I'm current co-president of Penn Blockchain, and we'll be moderating this panel. And here I have with me Ben from the Solana Foundation. We have Matt from Arbitrum. We have Grant from Fuel. And we have Matthew from Polygon. I'll let them give themselves a bit of a longer intro, and I'd love for you guys to kind of just introduce a little bit about yourself, what you do at your org, and also what specifically your org does to kind of tackle this problem of scaling. Are these on? Oh, just flick them right over. Okay. There you go. Here you go. There you go.
All right, cool. Thanks. Yep, so I'm Matthew Rossi, VP of Product at Polygon. The way that we sort of approach Ethereum scaling is through the use of sidechains. We're sort of a multi-chain solution. We're working on a wide variety of products, POS mainnet being the main one that's out there and with high adoption right now, but several ZK zero-knowledge type projects in the works, in the pipeline, and I've also been spending a lot of time on sort of app chain type solutions as well. So we think about scaling from sort of a multi-chain approach. Yeah, that's sort of what we've been up to.
Hey, I'm Grant Gerber.
Should be good.
Sick. I'm the ecosystem growth lead for Fuel Labs. So my focus is primarily on finding more applications to build out our network and to just sort of grow the overall state of the ecosystem. Fuel, as a network, is really focused on right now scaling Ethereum through providing our own sort of unique spin on a layer 2, in that we have our own virtual machine, our own language, our own tool chain. Through all of these systems that work very cohesively together, we really try to put an emphasis on really strong developer experience and making the onboarding flow for both devs and users as seamless as possible.
Hello. Hey, I'm Matt. I work on product at Arbitrum. For those of you that don't know, Arbitrum is a suite of scaling solutions for Ethereum. We have 2 chains live on mainnet today. One is Arbitrum 1, an optimistic rollup, and Arbitrum Nova, which is a kind of similar type of chain with some trade-offs to get you with cheaper fees using a data availability committee. My main focus, kind of running the product team, is to think about our 2 main products, how we can make them better, and some new things that we're working on. Earlier this week, we announced Stylus, which is kind of an upgrade to the overall architecture of our underlying technology that will allow developers to write smart contracts in languages other than Solidity, which is pretty amazing. More to come there, but yeah, focused mainly on thinking about how to make developers happy, users happy, projects happy, focus on decentralization and security. But yeah, that's me.
Hey everyone, I'm Ben Sparango. I am the head of BD at the Solana Foundation. Solana is a monolithic layer 1 blockchain that scales at the base layer without the need for sharding app chains or L2s by utilizing parallelization in transaction processing. So it relies on the hardware of the devices and the improvement of that hardware over time with Moore's Law to improve scalability and throughput over time. In my role at the foundation, I focus primarily on the ecosystem, both helping ecosystem projects be successful as well as interfacing externally with Web2, Fortune 500 companies, anyone who's looking to integrate into a Web3 integration.
Thank you for all those answers. I would love to actually bring it right back to you and talk first about the perspective from an L1 focusing on scaling in a more monolithic narrative. How do you see and what is the general strategy on Solana on being able to capitalize on demand post-bear How are you kind of structuring the ecosystem to do that? And what is this, kind of elaborate on this core thesis of like this monolithic scaling solution? Why is that the core thesis behind Solana to this day?
Yeah, so the primary reason why we have a monolithic layer 1 without sharding, app chains, or otherwise is because we believe that the reason why blockchains have been successful so far has been because the composability of applications on that chain. And the position that we take with app chains or layer 2s is that it breaks composability, it increases latency, and harms the user experience of applications. So the solution that Anatoly, the founder of Solana, came up with is that with the addition of parallelization and transaction processing, you can get speed up improvements where you don't hit a theoretical ceiling in software scaling. So you can theoretically scale Solana into the future as long as you assume the hardware will continue to improve year over year as it has with Moore's Law for the past 50, 60 years. And then as we're positioning ourselves in the bear market, the focus hasn't changed much from before. We have focused additionally on new use cases outside of like there's a lot in the bull market of what people refer to as like degen trading and degen applications. So it's a lot of focus on how can we provide real world utility now. So we're focusing a lot on payments infrastructure, financial use cases that people can use globally, and other things like that.
Great to hear. To kind of transition to more of like the L2 narrative, I'd like to start with Matt. How do you see yourself looking to scale within a modular context? Why do you believe in the modular narrative? And also, like, what do you think differentiates specifically Arbitrum from the rest of the other modular scaling solutions?
Yeah, I think the modular concept is interesting. I think the vernacular has kind of evolved over time. It's led to a bit of confusion where there is no like one definition that I think everyone kind of agrees on, similar to jobs and everything in the world. But the simplest way to think about it, at least from our perspective, is we're focused on execution. So transactions coming in, kind of happening, being executed by the chain, and then being confirmed by Ethereum. Our main focus is making sure that that process is as smooth as possible and as secure as possible, and we rely on Ethereum for consensus. So that's been our like strategy from the start. Our goal is to continue improving the execution speed, the transaction fee structure to make sure it's as great for developers and users as possible. So, I mean, you can think about this as a general technological principle that you see across different products and different industries where, you have different groups focused on different things. They're able to spend more time and energy on their specialization, and therefore they're able to find more innovation. That's kind of what we found in our work, focusing on execution and focusing on kind of the developer experience, deploying smart contracts and making sure things are cheap. That's our view right now. I think it might change over time. I think, we're building a execution stack that works primarily with Ethereum and has lots of flexibility, and kind of as the ecosystem changes, we can adapt. And so that's our perspective. Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you think is like the main factor that differentiates your execution strategy compared to like other L2s in the ecosystem?
So right now, the greatest advantage that we have, well, there's two big advantages. Like, we were the first optimistic rollup with like interactive fraud proofs that actually were live on mainnet, right? So you kind of, if you trust the sequencer and you trust, kind of the admins of the chain right now, obviously, in the future, that might change. But, if you trust those two groups right now, the system is very secure and relies on Ethereum for that security. There are other optimistic rollups that are live that don't have that technology implemented. So as much as you can speak to kind of them thinking about fraud proofs as something that they're working on, it's not kind of a one-to-one comparison. That I would say is one of the advantages. The other thing is generally in the ecosystem, we've spent a lot of time, and this is not me, this is kind of other folks on the team, finding projects and finding developers that are aligned with our values. And we've taken a very organic approach to getting projects to come onto the ecosystem and onto the network. So we believe a lot in project stickiness. We do everything we can to make them happy and to make their integration as great as possible. So once they come, they stay and they build together with us. So those two things in parallel, we have the technology that works. We think it's good. We're always building and we're focused on that. And we have a lot of projects that are kind of committed to the ecosystem alongside us, and our incentives are aligned pretty organically. it's been working really well, and we're continuing to do those things.
Yeah. I'm curious, Matthew, from kind of a scaling suite of solutions, specifically within this modular narrative, how do you see Polygon looking to differentiate itself, especially with such a broad product suite?
Yeah. So we think about that from the sort of perspective of not trying to build like one size fits all, and understand that as more and more entries into Web3 happen, especially coming from Web2 institutions and all kinds of stuff, they bring with them like a different set of requirements that we haven't really seen in Web3 before, right? We heard a lot about compliance and regulation this morning. That's really important. So we want to be able to have flavors of our execution environments and our scaling solutions that can fit any use case. And therefore, we believe that we need to do that with a suite of tools and not like one thing that we try to like put everybody on. So that's sort of been the way that we've approached it, and that's why you're seeing sort of the multi-chain and sort of the app chain narratives coming out of the Polygon project, because we just feel like that is the way that we can bring more and more Web 2 into Web 3 spaces. By just being able to customize and having chains that are sort of have just slightly different characteristics that help remove blockers from adopting Web3 tech, right? So that's been our approach, really.
Yeah, and how do you contend with the potential trade-offs of kind of diluting, I would say, like the technological mind share on building specific applications, whereas building a suite of applications? Like, how are you able to build fully robust solutions while also spreading yourself across such a wide suite?
Good question. Well, I mean, we're accomplishing that through sort of specialized teams. Polygon is sort of a conglomerate of projects right now. We've got a core team that works particularly around like our POS infrastructure and things related to app chains. But then we acquired some ZK projects, and they are sub-teams within the larger Polygon org that sort of work on their solutions, and of course there's a lot of collaboration happening among all of our projects to understand like how do we kind of link it all together, and that's an effort that's underway as we speak.
Yeah, I'm curious, Grant, your opinion, especially based off of these two that were just speaking, how does Fuel fit into kind of this modular thesis? And where does, these two seem to be focusing a lot on execution, how does a specified or specialized execution environment fit into this pre-existing kind of optimization of the execution stack?
Yeah, so I think one thing we really focus on at Fuel is improving on the existing execution environments through our own virtual machine. We've taken a step back and really looked at how certain or like existing VMs have been functioning and some of the constraints around them, and then we've been looking at solutions as well as to, well, if we could redesign a virtual machine from the ground up and say, like, what would the ideal solution for scaling be, for user interactability be, just for the general experience of using this system as both a user and a developer, what would that system look like? And so we've developed this sort of non-traditional like UTXO-based VM that brings with it a lot of benefits that just really improve the experience. So we can execute things like predicate-based order books. We introduce scripts, which allows for like more complex transactions, and we have full parallel transaction execution. So this sort of UTXO model also works to minimize the overall state of the chain, which means that we're not going to encounter as much state bloat, and we can have this more like lighter client system. And that just like really improves the overall ability for maybe a user at home. You have your like client running in like an in-browser wallet or something like that. You can then access a Fuel marketplace and run any application locally with like very minimal load. And through interacting with the data availability layer like Celestia, or eventually like when Ethereum goes like to full dank sharding, something like that, it'll just be an incredibly smooth process that really increases the autonomousness or just autonomous nature of blockchain, and kind of reduces the overall, I guess, like load for an individual user, for a developer. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious. We talk a lot about various different like methodologies and various different strategies of kind of like tackling the scaling question, right? And each of you guys are building different products to tackle that. I'm curious. Do we have, and this is for each of you, what is your perspective on the kind of core features that need to be built, or like the next core features that need to be implemented in order to scale to the next 100 million users, 1 billion users? Like, what are the core things that we're working on now that need to be implemented in order for that to occur? We can start with you.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. One, kind of in like the vein of the regulatory conversation we had this morning, is better on-chain KYC infrastructure, because that's a significant hurdle for anybody who's coming from an institutional background with strict compliance laws to use Web3, DeFi, anything like that. So having some sort of KYC infrastructure on-chain where it doesn't need to break the pseudonymous nature of blockchains, it just needs to be available in the event that a regulator needs to uncover who was involved in this transaction. I think that's super important. And then more broadly, onboarding more people into crypto is the thing that has stifled a lot of people. Is just like, it's pretty hard to do private key management. It's just something that needs to be improved upon. It's hard because like private key management is the basis for how you secure your assets in this. So any more convenience on that front also leads to likely less security. So it's a tough problem, but one that needs to be solved in order to onboard more people.
Sorry. I think there's two buckets I think I would think about here. One is kind of the protocol and the related infrastructure, and then kind of the general application layer. At the protocol layer, there's a lot of interesting developments that are happening right now. Kind of a trending topic, but really important one is this idea of like account abstraction. Some protocols have it built in, like EIP 4337 is kind of another alternative model that kind of relies on an alternative mempool. But the idea there basically, is kind of to remove friction from users when they want to make transactions, right? So allowing them to kind of give it to someone else to take care of for them, use different fees. Any problems like that, any technological improvements at the protocol layer that deal with friction for users, making the transaction kind of as seamless as possible and as flexible as possible, is really important. I think will continue to be important. I think similarly when it comes to state bloat, as we've talked about a lot, sharding on L1, sharding on layer 2s, in the future will be important. I think those are all interesting and all really important problems, but I would say the application layer is probably where there's way, way, way more need. I mean, most chains aren't full. It's not like we're all day long going and making trades on some dApp. A lot of wealthy people are, a lot of kind of somewhat committed people are as well, right? We've seen it, but the vast majority of people in the world aren't actually using the technology yet because it doesn't actually provide them value if they don't have lots of money already, right? So getting to a point where institutions are able to understand how they can maybe lose some of the profit that they already make and be comfortable with that by moving some of their infrastructure onto a blockchain so that more people could contribute to that. Think of, titles is a great example. You have this kind of middleman that manages this process when you're buying a home, provides basically no value to you, right? So if you could move that and convince an industry like that to move on chain, all of a sudden many more people start to benefit, and then you have a lot more utility to users. So I think pushing the envelope there, continuing to invest in interesting projects, working with institutions and regulatory frameworks to get everyone on the same page about kind of where we are moving to as a society. Is way more important, but obviously will only be kind of enabled by the technology. So that's my view.
I think generally, like what you mentioned about account abstraction, this is actually something that Fuel has. We have full account abstraction implemented. And this is something that really allows for users to just like not have to worry about signing 5, 6 transactions, or more like, I guess, 3 or 4 to maybe interact with like an LP on Uniswap, or just really just minimize the amount of clicks that a user needs to make to actually do something on chain. I think it's the current state of things is very abrasive, especially when you're onboarding a new person and you're trying to explain to them that this could be the way that the future of finance works, that, well, not even just finance, but just the future of like remittance or any type of interaction between two parties could work, that they need to, like, the process is just as complicated, if not now more intensive on the soul because you now have to worry about like private keys and everything like that. So working to abstract away as many of those concepts as possible, minimize the amount of interactions that people actually have to have with a blockchain, while also ensuring that like confirmation times and speed, or confirmation times are low and speed is high, is just something that is generally going to be huge. And then for individual applications as well, I think we need to start seeing people sort of, one of the things we're pushing for at Fuel is working with engineers, developers, individuals in countries that have like impacted currencies or sort of local economies that are not necessarily in the best of shapes. So we have a huge developer community in Turkey, a lot in South America, and generally regions which have like either huge amounts of inflation or their country has like poor fiscal policy, which is leading to issues with basically the individual just being able to control their finances themselves. So we've been looking at all of these developers and really working with them to say like, okay, well, like, what is the best application that you could use on a daily basis that would improve your life and that would improve your community's life? And how can we help you build that? And how can we provide the resources for you to build that, to then show as a use case and a real proof of concept that this is something that isn't necessarily going to be used to like, oh, like we're in the US, where we need to like rip tokens all day long on Uniswap and go on like Kisha, Inu, Katana, Doge, or whatever. But that there actually could be like local communities that would use these systems to remit amongst themselves and just create more sustainable value at the individual level.
Cool. Everything they said, for sure. I mean, on account abstraction, of course. I mean, I don't think gaming really is going to take off in Web3 until we've got things like session keys and other ways that you can have like a nice streamlined Web2 experience, but with like full ownership of your digital assets on the back end. Like, that's the only way we're going to get there. You know, the state issues, obviously, all these chains that have been deployed now going into 3-4 years of main nets, I mean, they're getting bigger and bigger. How are we gonna continue to sort of handle all that is really interesting. I also think a lot about different kinds of economic security models. Like right now, we've got this sort of, you know, get your validator set, and then there's that, you know, particularly for us, because we're kind of moving forward in sort of like an app chain world. But when you think about it from an application, like you're only as strong as the weakest link. And so if you are deployed on a well-secured blockchain, like any of the ones that are sitting on stage today, but you're using middleware components that maybe only have like just a fraction of the security, the economic security that your chain does, your app is only as good as that least common denominator, right? So we have thought a lot about and been sort of inspired by some of the conversations now around restaking and other sorts of sort of economic models to kind of like expand stake to middleware, to app chains. Like how do we do that successfully so that no one's having that cold start problem of how do I bring economic security to my chain on day one? And you know, instead of having this kind of slow march for that, which means that you then have to put up a whole bunch of technology and make centralization decisions because you need to like keep your sort of your new thing locked down for some period of time. Like how do we sort of, you know, get there faster from sort of a decentralization perspective? So yeah, we think a lot about that too. I think it'll be important.
Yeah, that's interesting. I see we touch a lot on kind of focusing on UX, you know, specifically within the expression of accounting abstraction, and then generally like, you know, execution scalability. I'm also curious whether or not you guys have any specific insights into how you're thinking about like the scalability of decentralization, things like client support. Are you kind of focusing on a specific solution? Are DA layers the solution there to being able to support like clients in the future? Is it something that you want to build that's like protocol enshrined? I'm curious, especially from the L1 perspective, like what are you guys doing is, to kind of focus on being able to actually support decentralization in a scalable manner as well? Curious to start there.
Yeah, so there's a few different things. The thing that is most important for us in the near term is if Solana's gotten to the point where decentralization from like a node perspective has reached a point where we feel comfortable with, and that's measured via Nakamoto coefficient, meaning like the minimum number of nodes required needed to collude in order to adversely affect the network. So that is something that we're comfortable with right now, and what we're focusing right now on is client diversity. So the Jump crypto team is currently working on a new Solana validator client called Fire Dancer, where they are basically picking apart the existing Solana core client into different segments and innovating on how they can improve throughput and performance of that, and then at the end having a completely new client where now you have multiple clients on the network. So in the event that there's a bug in one particular client or it's subject to a certain vulnerability, it's not subject to that same vulnerability in a different client. So network reliability can be assured and things like that. So that's what we're focused on.
I won't speak for the EF and kind of like the development going on at L1, but I will say that, you know, thinking about light clients, thinking about sharding, thinking about client diversity, all of these things I know are being actively worked on kind of all the time, and it's really tough. I mean, to envision a world where everyone on their phone is kind of running a validator is interesting. It may happen. I think a light client is a possibility. I'm also just like not convinced that we could bake that into kind of behavior for everyone. The way that I guess we are approaching it from our end is, you know, the nodes that we have like relay nodes, then we have the validator nodes, which are really kind of the key piece of software that kind of keep Arbitrum secure. It's a trade-off. It's a hard conversation we've been having lately where as you deal with increased state bloat, assuming all the things we talked about in the previous question happen, and more people come on, which obviously we're hoping is the case, there's a tough trade-off you have to make between allowing as many as people as possible to validate a chain and making sure that the chain is fast. Because nobody cares about using a chain if it's slow. And so it's tough. I think what we have realized is really the most important thing to do is, again, as we mentioned, focusing on performance of the node software. There's been a lot of improvements. You know, we rely on Geth, kind of the Go Ethereum implementation. There's another client called Aragon, which is really performant, and we've been exploring kind of ways to make that work on our end. The other thing is just generally proving is really tough. Executing transactions, again, for the sake of argument, you know, validating whether or not something actually happened in the correct order is really taxing on a computer. And so we found a way to make it performant. We find ways to make it more performant as time goes on. So I think really focusing on kind of where you can contribute is our perspective.
With Fuel, we're really thinking about these data availability layers and just the sort of like modular thesis as this next stage of blockchain and kind of like looking at maybe like what is 5, 10, 15-year outlook, 100-year, I mean, you could just assign any X number for years here as to what this looks like. And by sort of taking these concepts and saying like, let's have a razor-focused environment on execution, let's have an environment that's just for data availability, like Celestia, for example, and then utilizing these systems in tandem, we can just, again, create like a much smoother experience for like node runners or anyone in that vein. So this idea of utilizing like these other layers to like complement the existing environment, I think is just beneficial overall. Yeah.
I guess the way Polygon's approaching is our ideal setup looks something like us as the execution layer, Ethereum as the settlement layer, and then a DA layer. Well, we're building one in-house called Avail, but it's a Celestia-like product. Yeah, and then ultimately, you know, allowing us to just kind of, you know, keenly focus on execution layers and flavors of execution layers that align well to the kinds of use cases that we're seeing. And we just feel like there's enough use case variability that, like, again, like which sort of holds up our thesis of like, let's optimize for particulars. We've heard compliance many times, absolutely. Yeah, and then, you know, you want gaming versus DeFi, obviously the rules are different, and you want to be able to optimize, like, and pull on specific levers and everything to keep your chain as performant as possible, but also be able to bring whatever features that vertical needs to sort of optimize it, is sort of the way we think about it.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I kind of want to actually transition and focus on some more like product-specific topics for each of you, specifically focus on your ecosystems. So I'm curious if we could dial in a little bit more about, we talk about kind of scaling generally, how you guys are tackling it. I'm curious on like specifically within the context of your products and what you're building, what does that look like, kind of broad context? And so I'll start with you, and I want to ask, I think a lot of questions and a lot of the big question on people's mind when it comes to Solana is surrounding the ecosystem. There have been a lot of like negative shocks to the Solana ecosystem recently. What have been like the biggest learnings of the past, I'd say like quarter or two? And has that really changed your perspective on how you approach growing the ecosystem from here on forward?
Yeah, definitely. So a couple things. I would say that one in particular is that security is paramount. So Solana is a brand new architecture with a different development environment, departing from the EVM where it doesn't have like tried and true development and testing frameworks. So there's a lot of new vulnerabilities that were uncovered, especially in like 2022, that we had to deal with. So we're hyper focused on making sure that security around dApp development is paramount for this year. Also, it's important, especially from like a DeFi perspective. I'll back up for a second. So like the rest of the Solana ecosystem, like the NFT ecosystem, the gaming ecosystem, DAOs and payments are like the four verticals that we focus on, were like relatively unaffected. I would say that like DeFi was primarily affected most recently just due to like general macro deleveraging and also the blow up of a few particular liquidity providers that we're all familiar with. DeFi in particular has been like affected more heavily than the rest. So we're focusing there with helping them rebuild security as well as liquidity. And they're basically starting from ground zero again. It's like, how do you rebuild consumer confidence and also offer new use cases that are going to drive more people in? So in addition to that, like the team at Solana Labs and a few of the people at Solana Foundation are working on like different products that can like plug into those things. So for example, we're making a very huge mobile push through a Solana Labs subsidiary called Solana Mobile. Solana Mobile is working on Solana Mobile Stack, which is an Android-based operating system that is going to be like Web3 optimized, so it's going to make it very easy to interface with a Web3 application from the mobile device. In addition to that, we're also launching the Solana Saga phone, which has a hardware security module built into the phone where you just simply scan your fingerprint on the back end and it signs with your private key to make it easier to use mobile applications. And so the idea of like building product like that is to all feed back into the existing applications on the chain and make it easier and more accessible for people to use those things.
Yeah, and it really ties back into the conversation we're having about account abstraction and UX being like the next step. And it makes sense that you're focusing on kind of ecosystem growth along those lines. Kind of want to move it over, and I want to ask specifically about kind of the optimistic rollup architecture moving into the future. We're seeing a lot of growth of kind of ZK-based solutions. What is your perspective on kind of like the end state of optimistic rollup architecture? Do you think there's kind of coexistence with ZK solutions? Do you think it's going to be like one or the other? How do you position yourself given like kind of that dichotomy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think probably the most common one, because obviously it's a huge trade-off that kind of relatively easily is seen from the outside. I think there's a general perspective right now that we have, which I would say is true, which is that optimistic rollups are here and they work and they're vibrant. And so from a user, from a project, from an investor, from a kind of industry perspective, kind of that's the prototypical offering that you can think about when you want to deploy a project that has great execution, great fees on the EVM. I think longer term, there's no silver bullet answer. I mean, the way that we think about this is ZK tech is kind of maturing, it's improving, we're aware of it, we think about it all the time, but if there's a day that comes where all of a sudden there's a solution that works, we'll be there, we'll be ready. I think from a developer perspective, like to be really frank, it's tough to do things in ZK environments right now. I mean, if you look at Starkware, using a specific language that has a different way of dealing with memory to build an application for the first time, you're really stuck in there if you just deploy something and then want to switch, there's a huge switching cost. So not only is there just like from a development perspective a lot of a kind of overhead, but there's also like financial overhead. Proving is not cheap, and it can get cheaper, sure, but right now it's really expensive. So unless you're like a DYDX with incredibly high amounts of transaction volume and you want to bundle those up and then obviously compress them, dramatically into a small little proof that goes on the base layer, which is a perfect fit for ZK technology, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to try and use that tech as your first go right now. So, again, I'll say it, we believe optimistic roll-ups are here to stay. Obviously, they're coexisting right now with ZK Tech, and as the future goes, things may change, and we'll be there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm curious, actually, from kind of Polygon's perspective, building ZK solutions, as well as a couple other things, is there a specific solution in the suite that you're most excited about that you really think is going to achieve product market fit? You talked about kind of tackling all these different use cases. Is there a use case that you're particularly excited about kind of bringing to market?
I think that the 3 projects all have their own particular flavors that are going to appeal to developers depending on the kind of application that you're trying to build. ZK EVM is shooting for full EVM equivalence, so it sort of drops the friction that we just sort of heard about, like take your smart contract that you deployed onto Ethereum or even Polygon mainnet and put it there, and it works. And that's different than the way, say, the Maiden team is approaching, which is like their whole thesis is no EVM. We do all state off chain, and we write proofs to prove that everything that happened off chain happened in a compliant and or safe way. So just completely different design spaces, and I think like those appeal to what are you doing now, and do you have are you building for today, or are you building for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months from now? That will push you to one product or the other, and then also obviously like the kinds of features that you're trying to build in under the hood, for sure, will impact that. So I can't say that I have a favorite. I think they're all, again, it comes down, for me, everything comes down to what is the use case that you're trying to drive. If you're already deployed, DeFi project on mainnet, then ZK EVM, you get a lot of benefits from moving there. And I do agree that even though we're not maybe there on the performance yet, it's going to get there. We're ahead by about 12 months of where we thought we would be today on some of the ZK tech. So it's coming. I think this is going to be a big year for a lot of it, especially Polygon. And yeah, so we're really excited about all that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear. I'm curious specifically also on Fuel. How do you think about, especially within the context of kind of what you said about these different use cases, how do you think about building a kind of customized execution environment that's just supposed to be kind of like a 10x improvement versus a lot of people are talking about, okay, what about building execution environments is somewhat similar to the app chain thesis. What about building execution environments that are, customized for my specific use case, give like DYDX, right? It's a good example there. How does Fuel kind of tackle that trade-off of wanting to build a generalized but just simply better execution environment and also contending with specialized needs of developers?
Yeah, so with Fuel, we make it very easy for developers to, if they want to spin up their own instantiation of Fuel, for them to do so. So we have, for example, there's an on-chain order book building right now that's predicate-based called Sail. And depending on how far they want to go into their full product launch, it may make a lot of sense for them to build out this. Just like they will run their own version of Fuel, which would be completely composable with every other version of Fuel. So there's a lot of systems like that in place that just make it easier for I don't even want to call it a main Fuel because it's not really, but there could just be many different fuels. We have propane, gasoline, benzene. There could be many different fuels that all exist in tandem and can communicate with each other effectively. So you could have a chain or a fuel that has hundreds of different applications on it that are used and trafficked regularly that still see significant usage. and we're still pushing through incredibly high, TPS and throughput. And then there could be another version of Fuel which has like more maybe like customized features or like app-specific requirements that just exists in its own world, but still communicates effectively.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a really interesting kind of model that I actually haven't heard from most other kind of like execution environment attempts. So that's something to look forward to. I'd like to say we're out of time, but thank you all for coming up. We'd love for you guys to shout out your socials or where people can kind of connect with you real quick before we kind of end this off.
Sure. You can find me. My email is ben@solana.org, or you can find me on Twitter @BennyBitcoins.
I think my email is matt@offchain labs, and I have a Twitter, but I don't really use it. I read it, but yeah, I think it's my name. Yeah.
Sick.
You can follow Fuel at @FuelLabs_. We couldn't get the Fuel Labs yet. And then you can follow me on Twitter @ManOfFrogs.
I love the tags.
No, that's hard
I
to
just
follow
really
up.
like frogs. All right, cool animals.
Great. I'm on Twitter @MatthewRossi. No frogs.
The contrast is great. This is great.
Telegram @Rossi NYC.
But again, thank you all for coming up here. Really appreciate it. Let's give a final hand to the speakers we have.
Thank you guys so much for coming out. We'll be transitioning right away to the next panel, which is on valuation in Web 2 and Web 3. And I will be passing it off to Sudhi, who has been working in the space. He's a second-year MBA here at Wharton, has been investing for a long time, and will be able to have this conversation about valuation with a lot of people in VC. I'll welcome them out right now.